Thank you for tuning in to Hacks and Hobbies with your host, Junaid. In Season 2 of Hacks and Hobbies, we're visited by our amazing guests coming from all walks of life who want to learn their story, their struggles, and their journey on how they got to where they are today. So stick around. In this episode, I could speak with Philip Morgan. Now, I've been following Philip's story for over a year now. I've been reading his PMC daily emails, and we had a chat last year. And I was actually introduced to him by my good friend Fouad Kamal, who is also on this episode, who is also on this podcast. We talked about cycling. But I was like, I've been getting so much value from these emails, and I like the way Philip thinks, and that's one of the reasons why I had to talk with him. So why don't I bring him on the podcast? And Philip graciously accepted the invite. Philip, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast.
Junaid, it's great to be here. Good to talk to you today.
Fantastic. I love it. So some of the things that Hacks and Hobbies is around is, like I mentioned, in the green room. I picked up that green room term from being interviewed by a good friend David yesterday. And he's like, in the green room, we had this talk. Like,
Nice.
green room. So in the green room, we talked about, the different struggles that I've been going through, the many different things that I have been involved in, and just getting my feet wet into these things. And that's one of the reasons why I have the podcast, Hacks and Hobbies, because I have a ton of hobbies, and I'm always learning about new things and trying my hand at it. One of the new hobbies that I picked up this year is acting. And I was lucky enough to do two commercials, paid commercials. And I was like, dude, that's
like TV commercials?
Like TV commercials. One of them is Kaiser Permanente. I still haven't seen their stuff. They said it was going to be online. I think that was late last year, and then a couple of months ago, I was in this commercial for a IRA or a retirement ad, or a company that sells retirement products or investment products that you can use. So that was an excellent experience. Yeah. So I'm involved in so many different things, and I was talking to Philip in the green room, like, how do I get to the point where I start monetizing? Like, what do I do? And sure, I've had experience as a user experience designer, and that's a place that I'm trying to get back into to help other companies and enhance their user experience. But then it all comes down to, okay, what am I really passionate about? What do I want to do for the next 10, 15, 20 years of my life, even if I have that?
Yeah.
And Philip had some good points. Just figure out what works and what's going to get you paid tomorrow, or what's going to get you paid in the next couple of weeks. And it all comes down to, okay, just focusing, sitting down and spending that hard work time to put the things together. And we have talked about these things on the podcast with other entrepreneurs, and they've said almost the same thing. And it comes down to how you manage your time. So one of the things that I like to ask my guests is, tell us a version of your journey that no one's ever heard before, because there's a story that you tell your people, or tell your audience and tell your followers, this is my story, this is how it came up. And then over time it becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. So what's that journey for you, Philip?
That's the opposite of a legend, right? Like a legend becomes bigger and bigger each time it's told.
Exactly.
So what a shame that we go the other way when we be trying to create a legend.
Yeah.
I was thinking about your question as you were saying it, and going, wow, I'm not trying to psych myself out here, but I email an email list I've been doing this for 3 years, since
Wow.
mid-January 2016.
Mhm.
So 3.5 years.
Yeah.
I recently changed how I was doing the list, but for most of those 3 years, it was, 5 days a week. I was trying to write something worth reading.
Mm.
And that kind of puts me at a disadvantage when it comes to telling a story no one's heard, because
Yeah.
telling parts of my own story through that
Yeah.
email list, not every time, that
Mhm.
would get monotonous, but I've been doing that for a long time.
Yeah.
Um, I think I've mentioned at some point that I was so bad at self-employment that my wife and I were selling like pieces of furniture to
Mm.
make mortgage. This was early on in my self-employment career, which began in 2008 when I
Mm.
got laid off. A lot of other people at the same company got laid off because the
Yeah.
company was not doing very well.
Mm.
So, that to me is such a vivid picture of um, incompetence and desperation mixed
Yeah.
together. And I stuck with it. And I've often wondered why, because, I have, or I had more marketable skills
Mhm.
because I was doing things like copywriting and writing white papers and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Why did I stick with it? Like, I could have had a job, but it seemed like it was this thing I just had to figure out. I'm kind of obstinate that way.
Yeah.
I have been for a long time. I got into the college that I got into, which was this college called Davidson College in North Carolina,
Mhm.
a semi-elite liberal arts school. And the reason I even applied was someone told me that they didn't think I could get in. And I said, we'll see about that. I mean, to
Watch me
myself.
watch me do it.
Yeah. And I did. I applied, I got in, and then I called the guy and I said, I got into Davidson College. And then I think I just hung up on him. So I've always been obstinate. And maybe that has something to do with what is now starting to become something of a success story. Like, there's still plenty of room for me to grow as a self-employed person, but I feel like I've figured out some of the basics, and now people, pay me to give them advice on doing that. So it feels like it's getting closer to something you could call a success story.
Nice. That's pretty amazing. And everybody has those layoff stories where they got laid off because the company was not doing good.
Yeah.
And similar thing happened to me around the same time, probably happened to you 2008 or
Hmm.
2010.
Oh,
And
you hung on for a few more years after I did.
yeah, I probably did.
You must have had a
Um,
more valuable skill.
well, it was multiple. It's funny. Like most companies have lasted back then, it was like 2 years or so, 2.5 years.
Yeah.
And this specific one, um, I simply got laid off because I was in touch with a previous CEO. And back then, we would print our, driving directions onto the printer, and I had printed it to the main network printer,
Hmm.
and the current CEO saw the directions. He's like, "I know who works over there." So the
Oh,
next
that's
day he comes.
hilarious. He
Yeah.
knew you were shopping around for another job. Is
No,
that
it was just an It was just an intro meeting. Like I knew the
okay?
guy from before, and he's like, "Hey, what are you working on?" He's like, "Hey, come check out my stuff." So he's like, the next day he comes to me. He's like, "Hey, I saw that you went and saw the previous CEO." It's like, yeah, I met him. He's just joined around. He's like, "Well, you can't work here anymore."
Oh man.
I was like, "What?"
Oh.
And I was like, "Okay, sure. If that's what you want." But lucky for me, when I joined that company in 2005, um, the president who had signed up my contract did the contract of a founder. So I had 60 days that still had to pay me
Oh.
before before I could get fired, or basically that was the
Severance.
severance
That's funny. Yeah.
severance package, 2 additional months. So I was like, all right. And I didn't find that out till later. It's like, oh, that's pretty cool.
That sounds like an HR oversight.
Yeah, it is. I mean,
Wow.
when they were starting back in '05, they were a very, small company. There was like 10 of us,
Yeah.
and they were just getting the business up, and they had just finished R&D on this new product that's going to go in the hotel industry. So it was a hotel industry, and all those systems that whenever you go visit a hotel, they have their specific DVRs or specific units. So you would go through their guide, and you have a limited number of channels that are available. So that was one of the products that they had built, and they had a video on demand system in the back. Anyway, so they were just starting up, and I got lucky
Mm.
and had some experience in that area working for them. So anyways, it was just fun. And then the second time I got laid off was the company was doing great, and they're a web marketing company, and they were like, we're going to hire another CEO because he can help us go public. And anytime you hear that now, I mean, anytime I hear that now, it's like, okay, I know there's something fishy going on.
Hmm.
Has to be. And 1 year down the road, the company just was not doing that well. The stocks were diluted by this new CEO. We had like 110 people let go,
Mm.
and I was part of that group as well.
Interesting. Yeah.
But what's crazy is that luckily I was able to get back on my feet and find another job in the UX area. But this time around, having so many years of experience and not able to show it, I guess, on paper, or
Hmm.
not on paper, but on a portfolio style.
Right.
Like maybe I need to do something else, and it's been the entire reason I started the podcast is because I wanted to do something other than what I was already doing. I mean, it's not. I can use that experience and mend something, comes something out of it. And when you mentioned, you have copywriting experience, well, that's an amazing experience to have because copy is always going to live on. Content is king,
Right.
right? So,
Yeah. As I'm curious if you see it this way, when you're thinking about that transition,
yeah,
I feel like there's a spectrum. On the one hand, there's things that people are already paying for, they already value. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there's things that people will pay for once they understand how to value it. And, I think like about maybe the first smartphone when it was introduced being on that far end of the spectrum where
yeah,
when you look at the overall human population, they looked at that and they were like, that is expensive and hard to understand. And like, I just can't imagine why I would need that. The phone I have now works fine. I don't need to browse the internet on my phone. I have a computer for that.
yeah,
And then, 10 years later, it seemed like everybody wanted one of those things.
yeah.
But, companies had to get through that. I'm sort of doing a hand waving explanation here. I don't know if it was exactly 10 years, but companies had to get through that 10-year period.
Yeah.
If you're an individual, that's harder because, well, what do you do? I guess you can get funding for your idea.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're more like operating on the self-employed service provider and you have this entrepreneurial idea, how do you cross? I mean, Jeffrey Moore would say, how do you cross that chasm? How do you get from the people who get it now, which is a tiny minority, to this broader acceptance of the thing?
Yeah.
So it's easier just to start with the thing that people already understand and value, which in your case might be the UX skills, right?
Yeah.
But it sounds like you're also you've got at least one eye, maybe one and a half eyeballs on that far end of the spectrum. And
Yeah.
you're like, well, what of these other interests could I nurture into something that produces good revenue?
Yeah. And that's really interesting. And one thing that I find myself into is I'm always looking at what's happening this week rather than what should happen in the next 2 years. Like, I am not a far sight thinker. It's just
Hmm.
like, what am I going to do next month, or what am I going to do next week? Unfortunately, I have that um, trouble of looking too far ahead, but I love ideas. I mean, I live on ideas. I'm always consuming ideas and what they can do for the future. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword, because what's funny is my wife is telling me, so she's a far thinker,
Hmm.
and she was having a conversation with her coworker, and her coworker was like, I wonder if the airline will let me take my carry-on on board if it's 1 inch shorter on the long side and 1 inch wider on the wide side. Would it still go? And she's like, "Oh, are you going on a vacation?" And he's like, "Yeah, I'm going on a vacation in August." And he's visiting the website for the airline to try to figure that thing out now,
Yeah.
back in June. And I was like, that's pretty far out thinking. And she's like, it freaked her out a little bit. And then she's like, now I understand why people freak out when she's thinking like 2 months ahead of time.
I had a funny, very similar realization. I was in the shower the maybe 2, 3 mornings ago,
Mhm.
and I sort of saw in a visual format like a heat map. Like if you took a timeline and then did a heat map of where my attention is,
Yeah.
it's this split thing. So there would be like a big red sort of heat spot on the heat map over today and tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
Very short term, very immediate. And then the other and the only other big red spot on the heat map would be 5 to 10 years out.
Mm.
So I immediately realized why I don't take enough vacation. It's because no one plans, I mean, not no one, but
Yeah.
most vacations are not planned 5 to 10 years out.
Mm-hmm.
That's just too far out to
Yeah.
like really plan a vacation. You
Yeah.
might aspire to,
Yeah.
a mountain, or you might have like a sort of vision of the future, but you're not actually planning. You're not
Yeah.
saying, okay, on this date, I'm going to leave, and on this date, I'm going to do this. And so there's this weird gap between, like 3 days out from today
Yeah.
and 5 years out from today, where I just don't think much about that time period.
What's going to happen in the middle?
And I would really love for other people to do a heat map like that so I can understand basically how weird am I? It's not a question of am I weird? It's just a
Mhm.
question of like, how weird am
How
I?
weird. Yeah. That's,
So it
that's
sounds
a
like your heat map is,
is very similar.
yeah, yeah.
That's a really that's a really that's a really great way to think about it. It's like, and I think it comes to, it all comes down to what we do as creators, right? You
Hmm.
write copy, I design stuff, and most, like, the need for these things is very immediate. Somebody needs a copy tomorrow, somebody needs this design tomorrow or next week. So that's the span of how far we can think about. My wife's job, like, she is a project manager.
Hmm.
She has to project these projects and
Yeah.
figure out when they're going to launch, and then she's doing a lot of planning with all the people and the developers and whatnot. So they have to work on something called like a Gantt chart style. Okay,
Yeah.
this planning stage, this is the initiation, this is the execution, this is when it's gonna deploy. So they have to already think in those terms. And what's interesting that I've realized is I've seen a lot more women. I've experienced a lot more women in the role of project planning and project management than men. I'm sure there's a lot of men in that role, and I've worked with very few of them. But a lot of times I've seen that, and it maybe comes inherent with their ability to multitask. That could be.
Could be. Yeah. I try to be careful about generalizations
No,
there.
absolutely.
Uh, yeah, the project manager just cannot afford to have that kind of gap
Hmm.
in how they think about the future. They can't say, well, we're going to focus on the next week and then 5 years from now, because that gap in the middle is critical when you're planning a project. And
Yeah.
maybe I'm not a very effective project manager of my own
Mhm.
life.
Yeah. I'm in the
I
same boat.
would be willing to admit that if that's true. Or, again, I just would love to see people who have had some success as an
Yeah.
entrepreneur do that heat map, and then people who've had some success maybe working in like a more traditional corporate environment,
Yeah.
and just like, are there systematic differences or is it just random? I would love to be able to see that.
Well, here's what we can do to get that heat map going. Maybe have a form of some sort where people can fill in what they think. So then we can
Mm-hmm.
form our own heat map for people. Like, hey, figure out your next 10-year heat map. What are you thinking about today? What are you thinking about tomorrow, next week, 1 month? And then it, I think it'll kind of push us in the direction of trying to think in those terms versus what are, and then I'm sure you have a list of people that fall into many of these categories, and they can actually fill out that form and give you that information that you might be looking for.
One of the interesting things I've done recently
Hmm.
is a small scale study of how self-employed software developers think about investing in their career, or not just think about it, but how do they actually do that?
Yeah.
And I recruited a small sample from LinkedIn and recruited a somewhat larger but still small sample from my email list. And has been very interesting. I'm not done with this study yet, but it's been very interesting to compare the two. And there are real differences. So I could probably do the same thing again, but with a different question, which is, um, yeah, that brings up some real interesting survey design issues. But the main question is like, where is your attention focused when you're
Yeah.
thinking about the future?
Yeah.
Um, so that's a good idea.
Hmm.
I'm likely to do something about that.
Cool. Awesome. I would love to see those results, and I'm sure you can uh, publish that as a paper, a white paper or something like, hey, this is where people's attention span
Yeah.
fall based on their job title or something. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Trying to correlate it with some other factor would make it even additionally interesting.
Hmm.
And then also, this is the kind of thing I could go broader with,
Yeah.
because I could survey a lot of different sample groups. And so a tool like Google Surveys, not Google Forms, but their paid survey tool,
Oh, okay.
could be a real interesting way to expand the data set. Now you've got some gears turning here, Junaid. Thanks for that. That was
Absolutely.
part of
Absolutely.
this podcast.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing that we use as user experience designers is there's a whole set of tools that, for example, there's a tool called TreeJack, and in it you basically lay out your information architecture for your website, and you put in information. So you basically input this data into the program, and then
Mhm.
you ask questions and then show them how would you get to this spot, and this is the IA for you to search for it. So it basically helps the UX team to figure out if the IA or information architecture that they have designed accurately maps to their thinking and helps the user get to the point that they're thinking about faster.
That's
So
fascinating. Do they recruit people for you to give you the feedback, or do you do that part yourself? They
so
being TreeJack.
well well TreeJack is just a software.
Okay, so
And so
you
UX people
recruit.
will go in there, and then you're already working at a company. So you
Hmm.
will recruit, users in the company. For
Got it.
example, the test that we did was, the HR site was convoluted. So
Mhm.
we did a design of the IA structure inside here, what it currently was, and we brought in a whole bunch of people, and we basically set up laptops in the cafeteria area, and then had people, hey, come do this little thing. You get a free, drink voucher or something,
Got it.
or
Yeah.
you get something. So they have some incentive to actually take that survey, and it probably took them 5 to 10 minutes to take the survey. And now when we look at the results, we can see, okay, people were having trouble getting this type of information from this area because they thought it was here, but it should have been over there, kind of thing. So
That's fascinating.
it gives you a lot of great, data back, and
Mm.
I'm sure that kind of stuff can be done for your purposes. I mean, it's an open software, and there's a lot more tools than just TreeJack. I mean, there's this immense amount of tools just around user experience,
Mhm.
because it helps figure out the psychology of our users. And products are meant to design for users, unless it's a device that is created just out of pure innovation, like the iPhone introduced back in 2006, and everybody was like blown away, like, holy smokes. Right,
Yeah.
when in January of 2006, Steve Jobs, he's like, it's got music, it's got internet, it's got email, music, and he just kept repeating, and it's like, it's a single device.
Mhm.
And what was interesting, when you were mentioning earlier about people having to spend that much money on a single device. Well, we already have a smartphone, right? I remember very clearly, before the iPhone came out, I had the same phone for 3 years. For 3 years, I had the same phone,
Yeah.
and I never had to take it in to get it repaired. I never had to do any of that. Right? It just worked. I might have spent some time with the software, trying to hack the software, trying to get some applications on it, but that was about it. But
Yeah.
when the iPhone came out, the first one was $650.
Yeah.
And then later on years, we had the subsidized option, but now people are spending anywhere from, nine, $750 to $1,200, $1,300 on a single device that they're going to get rid of next year.
And people lined up on the sidewalk
Oh, yes. Everybody
to
lined up.
be able to be one of the first to spend $650 for a thing that most of the other people in their life did not understand, did not value in the same way,
Yeah.
and thought was just crazy that you would do that.
Mm-hmm.
They lined up on the sidewalk to do that. So it's really fascinating to think about those kind of entrepreneurial wins.
Mm-hmm.
Um, those are not the only kind. They're
No.
I think, much more. I mean, to be blunt, much more boring
Yeah.
entrepreneurial wins.
Yeah.
But they still have the same sort of contours of not everybody gets it, and
No, absolutely.
it takes something a pretty interesting combination of factors to get to that kind of success. But it's, again, there's things people are buying today that they value today. And, if you were someone who just happened to get like a data science degree, it's interesting to me because now, I mean, like right now, that's a
Mm-hmm.
red hot skill or expertise or whatever.
Yeah.
But you would have possibly made the decision to get that PhD
Mm-hmm.
before it was red hot.
Yeah.
And so, the lead time that you would need to acquire that skill is so significant that there's just no way you could have known that it
Yeah.
was going to be a desirable skill. So it's really interesting to look at those cases, and you kind of have to, I think, say that was more luck than anything else.
Yeah.
A data scientist now who's doing some work that's highly valued, I'm not sure they could attribute their financial success to foresight or good planning or,
Yeah.
insight or what have you.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Well, one interesting thing that is a really amazing point, because it does take time, right? It'll take you 3 to 4 years to get that degree. And in 3 to 4 years, something might change completely, the need for it. And
Yeah.
having data science degree now, like, that would have meant that you thought about it hard enough, and that's exactly what you're passionate about to doing it. And a lot of the times you will follow the trends. Okay, oh, attorney's making a lot of money. Let me go and be an attorney. Well, you've taken yourself out of the pool for 2 years, right?
Right.
So yeah, there's going to be demand for it now, but maybe 2 years down the road, it might be a little different. And I've seen a lot of people that, they went for what they thought was going to be great, and then they come out all graduated, but there's no jobs, and there's a lot of people with bachelors that couldn't find a job. So they were like, oh, let me go get a master's, taking yourself out of the equation again. And then after you got your master's, well, I still can't find a job in the area that I thought it was going to be awesome. So some of the things that can help people is to be subscribed to um, knowledge that people share. Like, for example, foresight tells you, okay, what are going to be the hot jobs in the next 10 years? Well, that puts you on a path of, either a better thought, because now you know what's going to be hot in the next 10 years or the next 5 years. And so you have to see the trend of where technology is going, because there's so much automation now, and data science is helping with that automation. There's machine learning, super hot. AI is dependent on machine learning. And so all of these things, it all comes down to, okay, where's technology going? Because 10 years from now, I couldn't do all of this stuff on my phone that I can do now. And that's also helping, because I just read an article today that iOS 13 can now correct your eye positioning when you're doing FaceTime call. Because a lot of time when you're doing a FaceTime call, you're looking at the screen and not the camera. So your eyes, and a lot of people, when they're taking selfies, right, they're looking at the screen. And
Yeah.
you can tell from those selfie photos that they're looking at the screen and not the camera. And I have to make that judgment whenever I'm taking a selfie. But with iOS 13, they're already fixing that with augmented reality. They're shifting where your eyes are supposedly looking at, from down to up, where the camera is supposed to.
I know that to me, I installed on my iPad Pro, which is actually my primary work device. Like I do 90% of
Yeah.
what I do on an
Yeah.
iPad Pro.
Mm-hmm.
And I installed the iOS 13 public beta.
Yeah.
And then a few hours later, reverted back to iOS 12.
Mm-hmm.
For me, the most useful thing was the ability to use a mouse. Like
Oh, yeah.
I'm super excited about that.
That's a pretty
I'll
good
wait
one.
until
Yeah. No.
it's officially released, and it'll still be beta quality software, but
Yeah.
hopefully not as bad as what I loaded on my device.
I totally agree. So,
But this let me jump in
yeah,
and say
absolutely.
this feature you were talking about
Mm-hmm.
is perhaps one of the most fascinating features, because there's so many little interesting aspects to it. I spend a lot of time on video calls with my clients.
Mm-hmm.
What I do these days is not copywriting. It looks a lot more like advisory services.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm on the iPad. It's most convenient for me if that's in landscape orientation, which puts the camera on the left side of the device, on the left edge. I had thought, this issue is always on my mind, because the perception of me not making eye contact with someone I'm trying to help and connect with
Yeah.
I wonder, how is that jarring for them? Do they just sort of mentally compensate for the lack of eye contact because they know,
Yeah.
well, we're on a computer, and
Probably.
if you look at the camera, you're not really seeing the other person's face?
Yeah.
Or is it disruptive? I thought the solution to all of this would be that they would find some way to embed the camera basically in the middle of the screen,
Yeah.
like somehow behind the screen.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that would solve the eye contact problem. Didn't think at all about some them using their augmented reality
Mm-hmm.
capacity to solve it.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating. I don't know if it's going to work. Well, I'm usually on Zoom, not FaceTime.
Yeah.
And the camera is not above where I'm making eye contact. It's to the left of.
Yeah.
I don't know if it'll work in that situation, but it's just a fascinating thing. And then you realize, wait, this person is no longer looking at a relatively unprocessed video feed of me.
Yeah.
There's now this layer of processing. What else could that do?
Mm-hmm.
Will there someday be a video chat application that kind of is like the HR person in that movie Elysium, where it's just like this robot, and it's completely divorced from any reality?
Yeah.
I don't know, just it kind of gets your mind spinning with all these possibilities of what might be. It's really a fascinating feature.
Yeah.
But dark mode doesn't have that kind of fascinating future possibility built into
No, it doesn't.
it. It's a nice feature.
No, absolutely. So that's funny, because what's interesting is, sure, they did not talk about this attention correction in FaceTime on the keynote, because a lot of people are not going to buy the device just for that reason. And
Right.
they're like, oh, dark mode is going to increase your battery life. Well, that's the feature we're going to talk about.
Really?
And
I didn't watch the keynote, so
I didn't watch it either. I just went through
yeah, but you
the
paid
quick,
more attention to it
a
than
little,
me.
a little more a little attention.
Yeah.
I was pretty upset that I didn't get to watch the live one this time around, because I watch it religiously every year or whenever they have a keynote.
Mm-hmm.
So the interesting point you mentioned about having to look directly in the camera when you're doing your Zoom calls.
Yeah.
And what I've done, I use the desktop to Zoom calls, and whenever I'm doing the video, I have the camera, because I can move the camera around. It's a portable one. I can put it right in the middle of the screen, and then align the video window,
Yeah.
the video window behind the camera, so it feels like I'm looking directly into the camera.
I've done that too.
And
I've got a little tabletop.
Yeah.
It's not a tripod. It's like a light stand, but same idea.
Yeah.
Put the camera on that, and then positioned it so that it's, and now the camera's like blocking that person's
it is
part of their video.
Yep.
But I've done that.
Mhm.
I have, I thought about creating some sort of like periscope type device that would
Ooh.
kind of in the place where you want to be looking in order to have the appearance of solid eye contact, but then the camera is actually located elsewhere.
Yeah.
I mean, I've spent an inordinate amount of time on this issue that I think most people are like, why do you care?
Yeah.
But it's because I'm trying to make the most of the way I've chosen to work, which is remote.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting.
And then there goes Apple, and they fix it for me.
They fix it for you. No, it all comes down to, okay, if it's attention correction in FaceTime, they'll have to have an AI. I'm sure they're going to have an AR kit or an AI kit available, so then Zoom can tap into it. Because I think on Zoom you can already do a virtual background if you're using any of the devices. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah,
Things you think about, right?
Zoom seems to be doing a lot of things right these days, so I expect they won't be far behind with some similar feature.
Yeah.
And then I expect Skype to find 50 ways to screw it up, or the Microsoft. They seem to be paid based on how many UI changes they can make. in a
It's
given time period. That seems to be how they're compensated.
that's really they're not looking too far ahead of what they would be.
Yeah, right.
Because if they had looked too far ahead, they probably would not never have gotten into the mobile device space.
Mm.
Because remember, they had the Zune right after the iPod, and then they had the Windows mobile phone. I mean, what's funny is my first smartphone was a Windows mobile smartphone before the iPhone.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was running
Because
Windows.
that's the one you were trying to hack and get.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that was really interesting. I mean, Microsoft had done it right. They just didn't think too far ahead. Very cool. And now
Yeah.
now they've accepted Linux, and I think most of their operating systems on the server side are running on in conjunction with Linux. So they've got some Linux code, and you can um, do Bash terminals in Windows. It's really fascinating
Yeah, it really is.
where Microsoft come.
They have embraced a really significant level of change, and then
Mm-hmm.
avoided most of the opportunities to screw that up, which is impressive, actually.
That is very true. I mean, and the one good thing they've got going on that they started back in 2000 was the Xbox. Their The Xbox is a marvel of innovation. I mean, the ability to network and play with other people is just mind blowing. And it took Sony some time to get on that bandwagon and figure out the subscription model and whatnot to follow suit with Microsoft, as well as some of the other gaming machines that are out there. I think Nintendo took some time as well to get there. But yeah, there's all you've got to see who's the leader, who's doing the best, and that's what Apple's been doing. They're like, we see how all of these MP3 players are working. There's a big piece missing. How are you managing this software? How are you managing all of your music collection? Right. So that was an innovation in itself, iTunes. And I think iTunes is going away with the next version of Mac
Mm-hmm.
because they're breaking out podcasts and music apps separately.
Yeah.
It's interesting how this conversation just turned into an Apple conversation.
That was not where I thought we would go.
No, it's mainly because it's something that like you and I both follow, religiously in one effort or another. But when you mentioned, people who stand in lines, and I remember trying to get home from work, took me like an hour, and then going and standing in line
Yeah.
to get that first iPhone. So, and
So you were one of the early adopters, it sounds like.
That's right. I am one of the first early adapters, and then the next version, I got one for my wife as well. I was like, all right, one for you, one for me. And I think for at least for 5, 6 years or 7 years even, I've stood in line to get that first iPhone, when it first was available in stores. And not at the Apple store. I would always go to the AT&T store because I knew the lines would be shorter and just get there early enough to not wait in the super long lines. And then I was super happy when they started doing the pre-orders and just mailing it to you at your home. I was like, all right, I don't have to go stand in line anymore. I've got kids.
What's interesting to me is that I'm fascinated by all this stuff about how people create change or embrace or resist change. But I myself am not an early adopter. I am somewhere probably in the late part of the early majority or the early part of the late majority in terms of Roger's adoption curve. And so that means I'm weirdly risk seeking in some areas of my life and then weirdly risk avoiding in other areas.
Yeah.
So I mean, probably installing the iOS 13 public beta is a good example of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like I wanted to see if it was usable, because if it
Yeah.
was usable, I wanted to use it because it had,
Yeah.
these few features that I just really highly desired.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to take 6 hours out of my day to
No.
stand in line for some new thing that
Yeah.
if I wait 3 months, I can just have it show up in the mail. I'm not going
Exactly.
to do that. So
Yeah.
I'm this, I think, somewhat unusual combination of attributes. Like
Hmm.
in some areas, I'm just like, let's go, let's do something really crazy that may not work out. And in other
Yeah.
areas, I'm like, I want every guarantee that it's going to work out.
Hmm. No, absolutely. That's very true. And so there's the waiting and getting something, super early and figuring the kinks and then installing the beta software. I've done that in the past, and I was like, this year I'm just going to skip it. And they even mentioned that, this has to be like, do not put this operating system on your primary device. You will
Yeah.
screw something up.
Yeah.
And it's happened to me oh, I can't launch any of the apps that I was using last week
Yeah. Yeah.
because, they're not ready. Like, I just I have very little time to be playing around, with the limited hours that I have in a day. I just want to be all of them to be productive. I didn't get on the Apple bandwagon to be beta testing. I got on it so I could be productive, because then it just feels like you're on a Windows bus and you have updates coming every day. And,
Yeah. The
you
same
know,
thing, I think, shows up when you're deciding, as a self-employed person who
hmm,
provides services or expertise,
yeah,
you have to make that same decision. It's like, what are my services for? Are they for people who are going to get some benefit, maybe just emotional, from being on
yeah,
the bleeding edge? Or are they for people like maybe like you and I, in
hmm,
that we just can't stand the idea of losing time to figuring out half-baked beta features?
yeah,
Um,
exactly.
I mean, both of those are viable markets.
Hmm.
They look different. You
Yeah,
do everything different in terms of creating value for those markets, but
yeah,
they're both viable. And I guess the mistake is to try to serve both of them with the same thing, because that just does not work.
that is so true. That is so, so true. Now, one thing that I popped in my head earlier when we were talking about, collecting data and figuring out what people would be doing in the next 5 years versus next week,
Mm-hmm.
I have been collecting some of that data from my guests. Now, it's not specific to, what they'll be doing, but it's specific to some of the questions that I ask all of my guests. And I was thinking, what if I put that in the chart and put all the people that like certain type of movies in one area versus certain type of, you know, things in another area, and then see, oh, you guys will really like to talk because you both like this movie or this
Mm-hmm.
superhero or stuff like that.
That is the kind of thing you can do when you start building your own data set. And there's just so many ways you can do that.
Yeah.
A
Yeah.
very simple 3-question survey. It
Mm-hmm.
could be, a very in-depth 2-hour conversation that
Yeah.
you have repeatedly, where the structure of the conversation is similar enough that,
Mm-hmm.
look for patterns. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, that's what you're doing with this
Yeah. That's what
podcast,
I'm
is
doing
building a data
essentially with
set.
this podcast. Yeah.
Yeah.
One question is, I have that that pushes, or is that I keep thinking about is, what is some of the motivation for things that you do or things that people do? So how about yourself?
Well, the motivation is, it's a mixture of things. Like
Yeah.
I do want to have, um, an interesting career. I want to
Hmm.
do work that I find interesting.
Yeah.
I think, I sort of burned some ships when I landed on the shores of self-employment, and I wasn't super good at it to start out with, but um, I realized there was this potential for it to be interesting in a way that I never found working for somebody else interesting in that same way. So I think I just sort of fully committed to that. So for me, sometimes that's, in the motivation of what drives me, that creates this trade-off between like immediate success, like we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
If you want immediate success, there are ways to do that. But I do think also about the trade-offs that are inherent in that, because usually you're doing something that's kind of been figured out a little bit.
Yeah.
And what I want to do is contribute new knowledge or new ways of seeing things to what exists already. So that necessarily involves figuring out a different challenge. How do you keep money coming in to whatever degree you're looking for? And I've
Yeah.
realized that what I'm looking for is above average in terms of business revenue.
Yeah.
So then you're like, okay, well, I just have to accept that that's what I want. I'm not going to voluntarily put myself on an austerity program. So I got to figure out how can I stay interested, be breaking new ground, and also meeting financial goals, because you can break new ground on your own
Yeah.
without the discipline of doing something the market will pay for. And that I think might be easier than the other, which is break new ground in a way that the market will pay for. That seems to add an extra layer of challenge.
Mm-hmm.
So, that seems to be part of what motivates me, is figuring out that challenge. And it is something I think you can get the idea that other people have figured it out very quickly
Yeah.
because of that 10-year overnight success thing, and because of how the media and the press like to portray those stories.
Mm-hmm.
But there's this weird thing, not to take us on too much of a tangent, but
Yeah.
if it takes me 15 minutes to read, like a New Yorker or New York Times profile of someone who has accomplished something impressive,
Yeah.
then there's this sort of distortion where it feels like it just took them 15 minutes to accomplish that because it only took me 15 minutes to read about it. And I know that's like a weird thing.
That's very interesting.
But I think it's a real effect. And so it's hard for me to feel the weight, the emotional weight of the fact that that was a 10-year journey for them.
Yeah.
And I think all of us are subject to that effect. And I don't know if it's a known thing. I don't know if it just exists in my head. I don't know if it has a name. But there's this distortion where you
Mm-hmm.
read the success story and you're like, now you start judging yourself in an unfair way. Like,
Yeah.
why am I not further along, even though I'm 3 years into this and not 10 or 15 or whatever?
Yeah.
And so it can become discouraging to compare yourself. It's a little bit of that comparing your insides to someone else's outsides thing.
Yeah.
So, all that is a part of this thing of like saying, well, yeah, there's lots of buckets out there I could fit myself into. That's
Yeah.
not what I want. I want to make my own bucket and to own that bucket. And
So
there's a lot of things you have to figure out along the way as you're doing that.
that's an excellent point. I mean, and that's exactly where I'm at. That's exactly where I have been in the past few months. And I figured this out last year. I was like, I don't want to be working for anybody anymore. I want to be my own. I want to do my own thing. I have all this knowledge. I have all this experience that I can put into use and build something. And what validates you and I trying to do that is that there's hundreds of other people that are already doing it. Like it's not something that's in a fairy tale. It's been
Yeah.
done, right? It's
Right.
not a fairy.
Yeah.
It's been done already. Um, am I following those same steps that they've taken? Maybe, maybe not. And one
Yeah.
thing that opened up my mind a lot more was, reading Gary Vaynerchuk's book, Crushing It. And there's so many stories in there And like you said, you read a 15 minutes, your story in 15 minutes, and you discover their 10-year,
Right.
struggle, and you're like, whoa,
Yeah.
they did that in 10 years. Why can't I do it in 2 or 1?
Right. Exactly.
It's pretty crazy how that happens.
Yeah. Yeah. I am just really fascinated by this idea that for some subset of the human population,
Yeah.
just fitting into somebody else's bucket is not enough. Sometimes I'm envious
Mm-hmm.
of the sort of personality that is fine with that,
Yeah.
because it does seem easier sometimes,
Mm.
but what can you do? We're wired the way we're wired.
Well, exactly. Well, that was some great stuff, man. I loved it. I do have some questions that I asked my guests towards the end of the interview
I feel
and
ready.
chat.
Let's do
Sorry.
it. I feel
Awesome.
ready. Let's do it.
Awesome. So, what is one hobby that you wish you got into?
Well, I have an answer and I'm doing something about my answer. So,
Woohoo.
mountain biking is
Nice.
the answer.
Love
My
it.
wife and I have just moved to Taos, New Mexico, which is
Mm-hmm.
in the mountains, about 7,000 feet elevation.
Mm-hmm.
We're still adjusting to the
Yeah.
altitude. Um, but there's a lot of really cool mountain biking here.
Mm-hmm.
It's maybe not on the level that some of the spots we're at the southern end of the Rockies. So it's probably comparable to Colorado for folks who
Mm-hmm.
don't know.
Yeah.
Different than like southern Utah, which is also like a sort of intense mountain biking experience.
Some really intense stuff there.
So we've ordered some bikes, and we're gonna try it. When I lived in Portland, Oregon, I biked everywhere. I
Nice.
had a couple bikes, and
Mm-hmm.
so I biked a lot more then. And then we moved to some places that were not biking friendly and got rid of the bikes.
Yeah.
But I've never done mountain biking per se. I've had a mountain bike that I've ridden on the road.
Sure.
So I'm looking forward to, a little rougher, wilder experience.
Nice. That's going to be so much fun. The mountain biking experience I've had back in Colorado is we went to Vail.
Mm-hmm.
They take us up to the top, and we just downhill bike. It's
Oh,
much
wow.
more fun than actually climbing that 10,000 feet.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's gonna be fun. My brother-in-law has been a mountain biker for many years, and it's a lot of awesome experience. Actually, yesterday he tried going biking, and it was so humid. He's like, I bonked. I couldn't continue. It was just too much. He's like, I finished 2 water bottles, ate all these dates, and I just couldn't. He came
It's
back
the
and
opposite problem here. It's
yeah, opposite
in the
problem.
summer hot and
So dry.
very low humidity, which is also pretty taxing on your system.
Yeah, it is. Cool. Awesome hobby, man. I love it. What is your favorite movie or TV show? And if you don't have a favorite TV or movie show, how about a book?
It's been a while, but My Dinner with Andre is one of my favorite movies
Mm-hmm.
ever. It's weird. It's almost like the two actors. I mean, there's some other sort of supporting actors, but it's really just Wallace Shawn and this other guy, Andre something. I don't remember his last name.
Mm-hmm.
Having dinner and having a conversation. That's basically the movie. So,
Wow.
um, I mean, in terms of plot, there's not much there, but it's just exploring all these things that have some overlap with my life, like these sort of weird expressions of spirituality
Mm,
or art and the ideas of art, and but really also making fun of each of those things.
yeah.
It's not the kind of movie that would get any budget today at all. I think I
Mm-hmm.
just don't think you could make this movie today, but I just think it's wonderful.
Nice.
TV show, there's this series that I think it's on Amazon Prime called Patriot that
Okay.
um, I just I think I rewatched the whole thing, so I've seen it
Nice.
twice now, which is rare for me. mean, it's rare for me to commit to an entire TV series anyway. And
Yeah.
it's even more rare for me to go back and watch it again because I thought it was so good.
Nice.
It's not for everybody, which you can probably guess from my favorite movie.
No, absolutely.
But it's about this guy who is suffering PTSD and depression, and doing a very important covert mission for the U.S. government. Just super fascinating stuff.
Very cool. Very cool. I will have to check out the movie because I've never heard that before.
Mm-hmm.
And Patriot sounds pretty interesting. Is it just 2 episodes or?
Oh, it's two seasons.
2 seasons. Right.
Whatever, 8-10 episodes per season, something like that.
Okay. And is it continuing or it looks like it is
I
continuing?
believe they are going to have a third, although I don't think they've announced that officially, but my sense is there'll be a third season. Definitely favorite sci-fi TV show would be The Expanse.
Nice. Expanse is good too.
Yeah.
All right. What movie would you choose if you got to play a character in?
Probably My Dinner with Andre.
So you get to have dinner with Andre.
Right. Yeah. That's the question. Am I Andre or am I Wallace Shawn in that movie? Physical attributes aside, like which set of like life experiences would I want to embody? And that's a tough one. I'm not sure I could choose.
Well, that's the question. What character would you play?
Okay, well, I don't get a free pass. Then I mean, I have a 50% chance of making a choice I regret.
That's true.
So I guess I choose Andre Gregory, I think is the character's name. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. A couple more questions. Who is your favorite superhero if you're into that kind of things?
This is one of the things in your prep that I really spent some time thinking about.
Yeah.
And I think it would be Max from the Mad Max movies, particularly Fury Road, because he's a survivor. He's kind of quiet, doesn't call any attention to himself if he can help it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something about that kind of resonates for me. And maybe folks don't think of him as a superhero. Like that's something I was thinking about. I'm like, I just don't connect emotionally with these characters who have like superhuman powers, but I do with Max Rockatowski or whatever his last name is, because he has this almost superhuman level of endurance and ability to survive. And maybe that is a sort of negative fatalistic view of business, but I do think that's an important quality is I think the folks who are successful towards the middle and end of their careers are successful because they've survived.
Yeah.
And that's not to take away from whatever else makes them successful, but I think that survival piece is just critical. They've just had an ability to survive longer than others. They've just outlasted others.
Yeah, that's true. Fantastic. All right. Last question. If you were a board game, what would it be?
I think anything that involves like patterns being part of the success. So Tetris.
Tetris, okay.
Was it Connect 4? Was that the sort of physical thing where you're dropping these things like checkers into a grid?
Yeah, I mean, again, those are games. They're not specifically a board game.
Oh, that's true.
Like Scrabble or Monopoly or Risk or some that road.
Well, based on the name, I guess that would be Risk. It's been I may have played that once or twice a long time ago.
Yeah.
So let's go with Risk since that's a board game. Sorry, awesome. I keep trying to step outside the lines of your questions.
No problem. It's all
Get a
all
little
good. It's all good. It's all good. Well, where can my audience find you if they wanted to get in touch with you?
I'd send them to my website, philipmorganconsulting.com. I should probably see if I can get the misspelled version of that, at least according to my parents, which would have 2 L's in it.
Yeah.
The way my parents spelled it is with 1 L, and I've carried on that tradition. So it's PHILIPMORGAN, and then the word consulting.com.
Perfect. Well, Philip, it was really awesome talking with you. This was very intense conversation, and I'm looking forward to those Google surveys. I mean, I think those would be super interesting to take a look at.
I'm going to give that some real thought. That I think that maybe does. I didn't think that belonged on my research agenda when I first had the thought.
Yeah.
But now that we've talked it through, it seems like it could be pretty interesting because, I don't know, maybe others have already answered. I need to do a literature review. Maybe others have answered the question.
Yeah. Maybe.
Anyway, Junaid, I've got to talk. I'm glad I could bring some intensity to it.
Absolutely.
To match yours. And thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Philip. Have a great rest of your day. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this episode on Hacks and Hobbies. We absolutely appreciate your contribution. You can find additional notes on hacksandhobbies.com. Please share the podcast with your friends and tell them what you learned about our guest today.